Hello, everybody, and welcome to Zero Limits Living. I'm Dr. Joe Vitale, and every week I bring you inspiration and information to transform your life. This week, I'm so excited. I have sparks coming out of my ears. I have electricity going up my spine. And I mean this in the most sincere way because we're going to be talking about some concepts in science and psychology that is leading edge, that is breakthrough, that is brand new, and it is inspiring me beyond belief. I discovered this material and the author I'm about to bring on because I read a lot. And in my reading, I came across the book that I thought was and said was the best book of 2020. Well, he's still writing books. And this author has written a brand new book that we're going to be talking about today. So before we go too long, who am I talking about? Let's find out. I have Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He's an organizational psychologist, an author, world's leading expert on the application of the future self science. His books have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. His blogs have been read by hundreds of millions. He and his wife have 6 kids, and they're in Orlando. And I have him. He has agreed to be here. Doc, thank you and hello.
Happy to be with you. Very grateful to be with you.
Oh, congratulations on your brand new book. Be Your Future Self Now. Be Your Future Self Now. You know, Doc, you're writing books that are so important and so profound that your very first book is now out of print. That one was the Slipstream Time Hacks, was it?
Yeah, right here.
Slipstream Time Hack. Well, you've got one. They're selling it on eBay for a couple $100 per copy.
Yeah, there was only 500 printed.
Well, that makes it even more valuable. But here's the funny thing, too. Your latest book, Be Your Future Self Now, is so valuable, so collectible. It's not out yet. You can pre-order it on Amazon. That your assistant sent me a copy and it was arrested in flight to me. Somebody somebody lifted your book. And
it really got stolen, or it just didn't make it? Just didn't make it.
It didn't make it. Somebody, I don't know where it is. They say they put it on the front porch. It's like, I waited all yesterday. I looked all over the front porch.
We'll send you another.
Nah, it's all right. I jokingly said my future self has it, and when I catch up, I'll be there. And one of my first questions is, am I talking to your past self, your present self, or your future self?
I love that question. Right now, you're talking to my current self, but my current self is pretty influenced by both my past selves and my future selves. But yeah, right now you're talking to Benjamin Hardy as of April 13th. And if you talked to me tomorrow, you'd be talking to a different person.
And when you say that, because I got to read the PDF of your book, and I'm very honored to do it. And your book is profound. It's a masterpiece. I've already pre-ordered 6 copies. I'm going to be telling everybody, go get the book, Be Your Future Self Now. That's a done deal. You're doing brilliant work. And I mean that most sincerely. When I read your book, Personality Isn't Permanent, which I ended up buying another copy of it so I can put it on the screen here for everybody to see, which I thought too was a masterpiece, and it is. I couldn't wait to talk to you. And in your book, the new one about the future self, you're talking about how we're not the same the very next day. Do you mean that in the most literal way?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge that most people have is that they're not regularly referencing the changes that they're making. But if I looked at who I was yesterday compared to who I am today, there's probably a massive correlation. But at the same time, I've had experiences today that have altered how I think and are altering my trajectory and are making me rethink some things. Even just seriously today, a good friend of mine is really in the hospital with some serious health crises. And it makes me think about maybe some of the decisions I'm making and maybe some of the decisions I should be changing. So yeah, if you talk to me today and you talked to me yesterday, you'd be talking to similar people, but not the same people.
I don't know that we're all that self-aware. I don't know that most people stop and think in those terms. As you're bringing it up, I'm starting to think, well, I've lost a lot of friends and people have influenced me. Joe Sugarman died, Bob Proctor died, Dr. Hulen had died, celebrities, Sean Connery, people that I admired have died. Bruce Willis, who's younger than me, has been diagnosed with a health problem and is quitting the movie business, which is even further disappointing because I was wanting to be in a movie with him. And as I'm looking at all of that, I'm thinking a little bit like you in the sense that it's making me pause. It's making me pause and reflect, and I might be making new decisions based on that. And so what I was trying to get some understanding so that the people viewing will understand is, in what ways are we not the same? I gave an example, you gave an example, but if you wanted people watching to really reflect on how you're not different from yesterday, or take it to last year or 10 years ago if you want, how can they get clarity about that?
Absolutely. I'll give a quick little kind of story of where the science is at on future self. Keep it pretty brief, but then just provide a few useful techniques that I use as far as to continuously recognize how different I'm becoming from my past self. Mm-hmm. But Daniel Gilbert, he's one of the top Harvard psychologists who's been studying this idea for like 20 years. Gave a great TED talk anyone can look at called The Psychology of Your Future Self. He gave that back in 2014. But all of his research studies how people think really about their future and how they incorrectly think about their future. He wrote a book on the topic called Stumbling Upon Happiness about 10, 15 years ago. But basically what he did in his research was he asked people the question, do you think you're the same person you were 10 years ago? And the main thing that people do when they're asked this question is he really prods them to think deeply, like give a date. So if I was to go back 10 years ago, it'd be 2012. And so think back, where were you in 2012? What were you up to back then? What were your friends like? What were your habits like? It can be kind of tough to go all the way back and to like really get back into your former self. But if you start to look at it, you can see that things are a little different. How you see things have changed. What you value may be a little different. Your goals are different. Your friends may be different. Your tastes may be different. And obviously, if you're someone who's into personal growth and development, you've probably changed a lot in the last 10 years. And so that's just one recognition. But then you can apply that same principle to the last 5 years or the last year or the last 3 months. And again, if you're someone who's regularly growing and learning from your own experiences, but also if you're someone who's seeking a future self, if you're going through learning, but then you're regularly referencing back on your growth, you can start to see massive changes on the daily basis, on the weekly basis. And I think it's just good to, on a weekly or monthly basis, just look back and say, how has my thinking changed in the last week? How have my goals changed? It's just good to regularly check back. And as you do that, it doesn't need to take long. It could be like a 10-minute session once a week, but it just allows you to see that very regularly you're changing, you're growing, you're evolving, and your current self is very flexible.
And that's the important insight, because what the focus is of your book and the science that's coming around this, that I think you're the one leading the charge on this parade when it comes to the future self, is the idea that if we're not the same, that we're constantly changing, we have influence on how we change next. So can you tell me and the listeners your definition of the future self?
Sure. Yeah. So, your future self, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. You could look at it simply as your future self is the person you're kind of already set to become. So like Dr. David Logan, he wrote a book called The 3 Laws of Performance. He also wrote a book called Tribal Leadership. But what their research has found is that every single person has what they call a default future, which is the future that we kind of already know we're driving towards based on our current trajectory. Like if we were really honest with ourselves, we know at a gut level the future that we're kind of automatically creating. So that could be one view of your future self. It's just the person that you kind of already think you're going to become. What Dr. Daniel Gilbert's research shows is that most people think that their current self is basically the same person as who their future self will be. So if the average person, if I was to ask them, who do you think you're going to be in 10 years? They would probably say, I'll probably for the most part be the same person I am today. That's what his research has found. And in psychology, they call that the end of history illusion, which is basically just the idea that you're no longer going to be transforming through experience and education. So that's one way of looking at it. How I look at it is more along the lines of Albert Einstein, that imagination is more important than knowledge. And just that your future self is something that you can start to imagine and create and then get really connected to. And then you can use your future self to drive all of your behavior. And I actually think that everyone's behavior is actually already being driven by their view of the future. The challenge for most people is just that that's not necessarily a future that they're either aware of or that they want.
Right. Well, this is getting exciting now because you're talking about the default future. And the default future is, in my own words, if we remain unconscious to our choices and continue to go in the direction we're already going. So in other words, if we basically don't change much of anything and just keep getting up and doing what we do every day and thinking what we do every day, we're pretty much going to predict our own future. It's a default setting. Is that part correct?
Yeah.
And then the good news is that you can change that direction, that you can actually, instead of having a default setting, which with free will, you can take that, you actually create the target you, the future self that you want to go to, and begin making decisions now that help create that then. Is that correct?
Totally. 100%. And I know that you know this because you're someone who has created so many amazing things in your life by your thoughts, by your imagination. And what I really like about where these ideas are going, number one, Dr. Hal Hershfield, who's been studying these ideas for 15, 20 years, he's at UCLA. He's found that the more connected you become with your future self, obviously the more intentional and more intelligent you can become here and now. As you really think about, and what he talks about is connection being having an empathy with, like an empathy of your future self, recognition that your future self is somebody. They may be different than you, but they're being impacted by what you do. But also not only having a connection and empathy with, but then getting really vivid and detailed about your future self, really being connected with, and then starting to embody your future self. And what I like most about these ideas is not only can you really start to think about your future self and get really clear on who you want to be in 5, 10, 15 years. And obviously you can stretch it really far. Like one of the reasons I really like referencing my past self is to see how much I'm different from my past self. And that just expands my confidence that my future self can be insanely different from my current self. But what I like about all of this is once you really connect with your future self, really start to really come to a place of knowing, which is kind of like a place of ultimate faith where you know that who you want to be and what you want is already true. Then you can just start being from your future self. You can start being who you want to be, and then you can start creating that future right now.
This is fascinating. Well, I know from reviewing the PDF of your book that you quote some of my metaphysical friends, whether it's Neville or David Hawkins walks the line, but you got David Hawkins in there a lot. And there's something exciting about that because we're creating a future out of nothing, in a sense. We're creating it out of the energy of possibilities. And I don't want to put words in your mouth because I'm trying to understand a couple of things that I'm honestly wrestling with. So let me just be blunt and tell you. I
love this. I want to hear the wrestle. This is cool.
Well, I honestly am, because first of all, I am a huge fan of your work. I really am. You might remember when I read Personality Isn't Permanent, I think I was the very first one to review it. I certainly was the first one to create a video review and post it on Amazon.
I was blown away that you made a video review.
I've done it like twice for books, and yours was one of them. So I'm a huge fan. I couldn't wait to get the Be Your Future Self Now book. So I'm devouring it. And you're talking about creating the future self. And I'm narrating some of this so that the people watching can keep up a little bit. I don't want to lose them as I rush forward with my own questions and confusion. But you're asking them to create a future self. So they're imagining what they might be or could be or would like to be 5 years or 10 years out. The problem I'm having is in your book, you say that future self will be different from who you are today. If that's true, how does the Joe of today create a future self 5 to 10 years out that is so different, this Joe can't really imagine it? Do you follow? Am I articulating that well?
Yeah, let me give an example, and then you and me go back and forth and see if we can come to some form of understanding. So at the beginning of the book, I share the story of Mr. Beast.
Yes.
And Mr. Beast is obviously a really interesting character, right? 24 years old, like one of the biggest YouTubers in the world, has a company doing now multiple hundreds of millions, pretty much seems like anything he wants to do, he can quickly create. But basically the main idea here is this. So Mr. Beast, when he was 17 years old, this was back in 2015. He, and I share this, and anyone can go and watch his videos, but he made 4 future self time capsules. One that was 6 months out, one that was 12 months out. And basically, when I say time caps, what I mean is he's projecting his future 6 months out. And what Mr. Beast did was he talks to the camera. You could do this by way of letter. I know people who write a letter to their future selves, or actually more powerfully, to write a letter from their future self. But basically, what Mr. Beast did is he made 4 future self time capsules. One was 12 months, one was 6 months, 12 months. One was 5 years, which that one came out in 2020. And then one was a 10-year, which won't come out until 2025. The only reason I say, first off, his future self is way different than he expects, even if it's the one he imagines, is Mr. Beast back in 2015, when he made these, when he was talking to his future self, he was hoping and praying and imagining that his future self would have 1 million subscribers, right? But the thing he did not predict was the changes that would occur not only in himself, but also in his imagination over those 5 years. So his 17-year-old self imagined a future self that was a quantum leap in his own mind from where he was at. But what actually occurred when the video actually went live is he had like almost 50 million subscribers, right? He had almost 50x what he was imagining, but so many other things that he could have never predicted, because from like a systematic perspective, kind of using the butterfly effect, when you change one thing, you change everything. And so along the way, as he was working and becoming his future self, he could not have predicted all of the systematic changes that were occurring in him, so that by the time the 5-year Jimmy Donaldson, Mr. Beast appeared, he was so different than he could have ever predicted, even though the 17-year-old version of him who made the video and was saying, in 5 years from now, I'm going to have 1 million subscribers, he was really connected to that future self. And he was actually being driven by that. And that version of him became his identity. It became his behavior. It became his courage. Everything he was doing, he was being driven by that. But over those 5 years, so many transformations occurred that he could have never predicted, that by the time the 5 years elapsed, he was so beyond anything his former self could have ever imagined.
What he was creating, though, his future self in that moment when he's projecting out, was still somewhat similar, if not a lot similar, to that self in that moment. So in other words, when he was in the present moment and he was thinking about, where do I want to be 5 years from now?
That's a really good point.
He's projecting out based on what he thinks and knows is possible within the confinements of his ego and his experience. And I'm not playing devil's advocate. I think that's
a great point.
I'm just looking for clarity. And so if I sit here and I project out 5 years, and I just turned 68. So now we're projecting out into an age domain. It's already hard to imagine being in my 70s, but from 68 projecting out 5 years, and it's like, okay, what am I doing? A lot of what I would project is I'm an author. I'd probably keep writing books. I'm in movies. I'll probably be in more movies. I got my own TV show. I'll probably continue that going. Do you see what I'm saying? Is a lot of the future self would simply be predictable unless I'm missing something. There is one thing, and I'll shut up and let you speak.
No, I love this. I love these questions.
Excellent. Well, there's one thing in the book that it's very exciting, but it's the idea of multiplying whatever it is you want by 10. It's the idea of just, if you say you want to make 100,000, why don't you just change it and say you want to make $1 million, and you enlarge whatever it is that you say you want, partly to blow down any limits that might be in your head, and partly to steam engine yourself and get the rocket ship going with more of a desire to do something bigger, and probably bigger than anybody else has done. So am I going in the right direction here?
You're going in really interesting, cool directions. The second question you have is easier to answer than the first one. I don't want to miss that first one because I think there's a lot of cool stuff there. The second one I'll answer really quick, and then I want to kind of go back to your first one, which is a deeper, harder question. As far as the multiplying, I'm actually writing a third book with Dan Sullivan right now, who I've written a few books with, and this book is called 10x is easier than 2x.
Nice.
Yeah. So 2x, the challenge with trying to go for a 2x bigger future, whatever that is, it's more of a linear future. It's more of a continuation from where you're at right now. 2X thinking is basically using your past to inform your future. And so you use your past self to project out the future you want. And kind of from an 80-20 perspective, if you're going for 2X, you really don't need to change much of yourself. You can keep 80% of your current self.
Yes.
Whereas if you were to fundamentally go 10X in any area, you can only keep the best 20% of yourself, and you'd have to change 80% of what you're doing. It may be your business model. It may be your thought process. It may be the clients you work with. And so to go 10X, most of who you are right now wouldn't scale up to 10X, only the core 20%, which you would then go deeper into and then scale that up. And so what I like about 10X thinking, or just massive thinking, is that it immediately invites creativity. It invites new pathways. Yes. It invites innovation. It also immediately creates simplicity, because back to the idea of the 80-20, only a few things you're doing right now could go up to 10X. And so it really invites you to identify who is the core me that if I really tapped into, 10X would be natural. And how much do I have going on right now that's honestly just a distraction or a waste? And so I actually do like the idea that 10X is easier. And just as a thought for you, and then sure. If you want to, we can go back to the other question, but if you looked at your life right now versus some version of your former self that was, 1/10 of where you're at, would you say that your life right now is actually easier than your past self's life was at 1/10?
Yes.
Things are a lot easier for you right now. And so the same would be true of you 10X, wherever, in whatever direction you want to go, that for you up at that level, it would actually be easier than it is for you right now to produce those results.
Okay. Thank you. That's a great insight. I also love outrageous thinking, expanded thinking. I mean, I wrote a book on P.T. Barnum, who I think was 10Xing every day of his life. So I love going in that direction. I do want you to go back to the first question, what we were wrestling with.
Let's do that. Let's talk about that. Let's wrestle with that.
If you have an insight or two to help me and help the viewers, because the people that are watching this, I want them to go get your book. That's the easiest thing to do. Be Your Future Self Now. And you're giving away a chapter. Go to futureself.com, and the first chapter is there to read for free, and you can pre-order the book there or order it once it's out. And so we want them to go get the book. And we also want them to realize that they can create a version of themselves, maybe their ideal self. Again, I'm using my words, that's 5 to 10 years out. What I'm wrestling with is, how do you make that, I guess, different, expanded out of what my present imagination can come up with. And yet at the same time, it's from my imagination. I don't know.
Okay. Let me try this. And one thing I'll just say, for yourself and for all the viewers, if you were to ask me this question in a year, you'd probably get a much better answer.
I understand that.
I'm working from the confines of a very limited Benjamin Hardy. Luckily, Benjamin Hardy can keep changing. And so, but here's kind of one way I think about it. And I want your take on this. So there's a lot of research. Have you ever studied any of the research by Ellen Langer by chance?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay. So I love her work. Have you ever come across Counterclockwise by chance?
No.
Okay. So Counterclockwise is a book that she wrote. It was a really innovative study that she did. I'm going to use this as an example. And then we'll fast forward to your question. So one of the things that she did, she was really big on context, and that context really shapes people. But one of the beautiful things that she believed is that we as people can shape our own context. So I can not only shape my environment, but I can shape my thoughts. And so one of the things that she did was, this was back in the 70s, but she took a group of, basically back in the late 1970s, she created an environment that looked and felt like the 1950s. And so it looked. I
do know this, but the viewers won't know this. So go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So she took an environment that looked about like 30 years in the past, because again, this study was in about 1978. And so she made an environment that looked like 1950. And she took a bunch of people in their late 70s, early 80s, and some of these men were on canes and things like that. And what she did is she brought them to this 1950s environment, and she told these men, would you please just act and talk like it's the 1950s, and don't talk about anything after the 1950s. You can talk about anything that was happening at that period of time as though it is right now. And so if you're talking about your job, you're talking about the job you have right now in the 1950s, and you're yourself 25, 30 years younger. And these men did this for about 4 or 5 days and fully immersed themselves into the environment, into the context. And what happened was when they left, some of the men that walked in on canes who were stumbling in and needed help getting in, walked out fully on their own weight, walked fast. They were taller. Their fingernails had grown it's really what Ellen Langer was looking at was, can being in a different context and thinking of a different self impact you on a biological level? And it did. And that was really a lot of the core essence of her research. But and obviously they were in a physical environment, but they were also in a mental environment. They were thinking about their past self and they were kind of embodying their past self. The reason I use that as an example, and there's a lot of research and, you're very deep on this, is that your brain doesn't really know the difference between your imagination and your physical experience. And so if you fully immerse yourself in the context of your future self, and you actually start to really think about your future self, it could be 5 years from now, and you really actually give yourself the playful imagination of actually thinking about what's possible, you in a totally different context, you with different capabilities, or you with different skills or knowledge, or maybe having a different impact on the world. If you actually allow yourself emotionally and mentally to be in that context, and then to, one way you could do it is you could actually try to embody your future self. And there's a few different ways you could do it. You could film a video similar to what Mr. Beast did, although Mr. Beast was talking to his future self, but you could actually talk as your future self from that future-based context, or you could just simply write a letter. But I believe, and I've done this before, that if you actually start thinking from the future, and I would say kind of like using the be, do, have model, you start being from the future, then because you're kind of reverse engineering, you're thinking from the future rather than from the present. I actually believe you would start getting a lot of nonlinear thoughts. You'd actually start to think thoughts that are different from the present self. You'd actually start to be able to generate paths to where you want to go that are from the future. It would be a lot more nonlinear. And so I actually do think you could tap into the imagination of your future self, and it would be very different, but you'd have to really think about it and believe it.
Well, you just hit on a hot button there. I'm going to ask you about that in 1 second. First of all, I love what you just said. And there's a key word in what you just said, that, at least for me. And you said playfully. If you can play with the possibilities, in other words, if you can take the lid off what you believe, there's the word believe, what you believe is possible, because for a lot of people, and I'm kind of role playing for my audience here, they sit here and they cannot imagine a different reality. They have been, we're still in a pandemic. They have been in struggle mode for a couple of years or more. And who knows what they've personally been going through. So they landed on this show and they're hearing some raw about you can change your own reality and here's the future self, and shows called Zero Limits Living while they're starving or out of work. How does somebody who is sitting here in this moment feeling kind of frozen in time and place drop that enough to play with possibilities, to play with the idea? I love the word play. Now I'm starting, you've got me actually thinking about, okay, in 5-10 years, there are a few things that come to mind, and I'm smiling thinking about them. It's like, okay, he just took some of the lid and the restraint off for me by allowing me to play. And as for, then I'll shut up here. And as for imagining from the end, one of the authors you quoted in your book, the new book, is Neville Goddard. And Neville said, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, meaning you assume you already are your future self and live from that. I have several of his books signed, and several of them he signed it. Assumption hardens into fact. Assumption hardens into fact. So when you get into the sense of, okay, here's my future self, I'm starting to feel the future self, role playing that, playing with that, imagining that, living from that, being that, actually helps create that.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. And I actually love Neville's work. And he talked a lot about being from the future rather than to the future. And, his work really influenced my thinking as I was writing this book, honestly, very deeply.
I sense that. But what about the lack of belief? What if somebody is sitting there? I mean, maybe these aren't the people that are going to listen to you and I, but if somebody is sitting there, they're watching because I guess they want some sort of hope. They want to break out, but they feel like, yeah, that works for Dr. Ben, it works for Dr. Joe, but it is not going to work for me. How do we start to change the belief?
Yeah, I think that the first there's two things here. One is, and it kind of reminds me of the Napoleon Hill quote where he said, "Whatever the mind can conceive and believe." Right, and so you're working on both of those. I think that the first one is just actually the playful imagination. Whatever the mind can conceive, actually just mess with that, and that may be a big stretch for a lot of people. Is just actually, honestly, taking the journal and actually pretending that life could be different in 3 to 5 years in one or two different ways. You don't have to rethink your whole life, but you could, one of my favorite quotes actually from the book comes from Robert Greene and 50 Cent. And basically they said, and this kind of hits on a lot of the research that we're all being driven by our future anyways, but most people's future is only a week in advance. Most people's future is get to the weekend or pay the bills or get the kids to school. So that's the future that's driving most people. And what Robert Greene and them basically say is that we're usually dealing with so many immediate battles that we can't lift our gaze and think way long into the future. And we can't start letting our future self 5-10 years from now inform us. Basically, it's similar to the idea of urgent versus important, right? If you eliminate the urgencies from your life and you start actually thinking what's important, if I started just investing a little bit, even if it's just spend 15 minutes a day reading a good book or listening to you, just by planting those seeds mentally, you actually start to be able to have much bigger imagination. And so a lot of it, honestly, it kind of reminds me of the idea that your input shapes your outlook, that a lot of our imagination towards the future has everything to do with the stimulus coming in. And if you would just remove a lot of the toxic stuff that's honestly hope destroying and just start planting better thoughts, you'd already immediately start having a much better imagination. As far as upgrading your belief about it, how I look at it is, as I'm imagining my future self in a certain way, I might think about my future self, similarly to you, maybe writing better books, selling better copies. But I also know that my future self could be doing things much different. Like as an example, 5 or 7 years ago, I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur. I was honestly thinking about maybe being a professor and writing books. And so you can go in a different direction as you let a rabbit hole take you there. But as far as increasing the belief, this has just been my experience. Whenever I really start connecting with my future self and start getting committed, and for me, getting committed involves a few steps. One is the language you use. So there's a few different forms of language you can use. One is what's called descriptive language, where you're just describing your current life. And I know you've probably read the book, The Magic of Thinking Big.
Of course.
It's a classic. But one of the things I like that he says in that book is that you're either speaking castles into existence or you're speaking yourself into your grave. And so it's really important to be aware of the language you use, because the language you use actually shapes your perspective. And so if most people are describing the present very heavily, like, oh, I'm sick of work today, or what, but rarely are they using what's called generative language, which is language that generates and creates the future. For example, if I just woke up and I said, this is going to be an amazing day, I'm using generative language. I'm speaking the future into existence. And so one way to get committed is obviously to start speaking of the future that you're imagining. If you start actually talking about that future and telling people and using generative language, not descriptive language, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to learn Spanish. I've never learned Spanish before. I'm going to learn the piano. I'm going to build a company, whatever it is that you want to start thinking of as your future self. Start using that as your language, because your language does start to shape your worldview. And as you start speaking it, you actually start to identify with it. And your identity is really the driver of your behavior. And so as you get committed to a new future and you start to believe it, it's just going to be what you do. Another thing that helps me with my own belief, though, is that as I start getting more and more connected and committed to my future self, I start to be aware of the areas in my current life that are not congruent with that future self. Because I'm starting to really embody my future self. I'm really starting to feel like that's me. And kind of to the James Allen quote that you don't attract what you want, but you attract what you are. Right. Because I'm starting to really change who I am. I'm starting to be aware of everything in my life that now I like don't want around me, whether it's just, maybe it's a messy closet, maybe it's certain relationships, maybe it's certain engagements that I've committed myself to. But what helps me increase my belief is when I start eliminating the things that don't resonate with my future self, because it's basically you coming into a higher level of integrity with your new identity. And so what I have found is as I get clear and clear and more committed on my future self, and then I start removing the things from my life that don't reflect that, I really start to like believe I deserve that future self, using David Hawkins' language that the unconscious will only allow you to have what you believe you deserve. Once I start eliminating those and I have a lot more integrity with my word, and my word is now generative towards my future self, I'm now speaking about what I want, and now I'm aligning myself with integrity to my new word, I really start to believe it, and I'm really committed to it. And then it starts to become pretty easy.
This is amazing. You are a genius. I love what you're sharing, and I love how you're articulating it for me and everybody watching. So there's another kind of a devil's advocate question here, and that is when we're creating the vision of the future self, and I can go 5 or 10 years out and I can see myself, I'm a tap dancer and I can sing Italian, which I can't do either at this point in time. One of the first questions or thoughts that come up for me, and I would imagine for anybody watching that they're creating this future self, is how. In the law of attraction world, when people see the movie The Secret or they start hearing about setting goals, the old school way of setting goals, Zig Ziglar and the gang, and they write their goals down, one of the very first things that comes up in most people's minds, and it stops most people, is how. I don't see how I'm going to do that. And because I don't see how, it doesn't seem possible. What is the workaround or the hack to get past the how? I tell people, don't worry about the how. The how gets evolved. You don't know how when you set most goals. You might know the very first step to take. And as you take those baby steps, the how becomes apparent because you created it. But did I just answer my own question? Or do you?
I think you answered it in a really brilliant way. I love your answer.
Well, it's the Theodore Roosevelt quote: "Do what you can with what you have, right where you are." And as a result of that, you move in the direction. So I don't know. I didn't mean to take the words out of your mouth. So is there another way to say that if somebody creates their future self, they get a little excited about it, it's 5 years out, we'll say, and then the how comes up, which could stop them. They just could say, that's not me. It happens to everybody else. I don't know how that's going to happen.
Yeah. And one thing, that I think is a good invitation for people is when you think about your future self, there's an aspect of everyone where we have a fixed mindset, where we believe we just couldn't change in a certain way. And I really invite the listener to be open to, your future self in 5 years may have massively changed in that particular area that you could learn to master. Speaking of mastery, that you could actually master that particular area. You may be someone who's never really felt that organized, or, some form of weakness that you feel like you've had that you just have developed a fixed mindset around, that you just think, my future self can really keep expanding in these areas, but this one, we're just going to leave that out. Like, I really invite the listener to think, like, if there's an area where you feel like you've had a weakness, actually consider your future self massively strengthened in that area and has mastered that. But as far as the how, I think about it in a few different ways. I certainly am not too caught up in the how. Using the be, do, have model once again, if you really get immersed in the identity of your future self and into the context of your future self, and what I mean is you actually can see it. Like, you actually are starting to imagine your future self being in that place where you want to be at a higher level of consciousness, but also, situationally where you want to be. If you actually start being from that place, you'll start doing very differently than your current self would, because your current self is based on your current limitations. But if you really start thinking from your future, kind of using the idea of reverse engineering in mind, pathways open up that were really different than the ones you would have created, because your current self is thinking linearly, whereas your future self is in such a different location in like space and time that they would give you a non-linear. If you really thought about it, and if you thought about the destination, and using your words, taking a few steps forward, being your future self, you'd start to kind of get clear. It would take a lot more courage. It would take a lot more commitment to try the pathways that your future self would give you, because it's a lot more of a direct course. Your future self is right there and they're sending you signals, go do this. And so what a lot of the research shows, and I kind of break this down a little bit in the book, is that the research on motivation and on hope is very similar in psychology. They're actually very connected concepts. You can't actually have motivation unless you have hope. If you have no hope, you won't be motivated. Right. And so the concepts are basically tied at the hip, but basically to have hope, in kind of a psychological sense, there's a lot of different ways you could look at hope, but from like a hope theory perspective, you have a clear goal, a really clear goal. And then from that goal, you start creating pathways to getting there. And this actually connects with a lot of the research on grit as well, that from Angela Duckworth's perspective, grit means you have long-term goals, but you're very flexible at finding pathways to getting there. You're not just stuck, using Einstein's words, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. If you have hope, you use what you have, using what your language was, you move forward, you get feedback, and then you're constantly adjusting the path. You're constantly getting new information, finding new ways. And those ways are the pathways to getting there. And if you're committed and if you have hope, you will constantly adjust that path until eventually you find a way to get there. And so the how does take care of itself if you're committed and if you have hope.
This is great. How often should somebody check in with their future self? Is this a moment by moment thing? Is it like a meditation? You do it twice a day? What's your suggestion, advice, or what's the science show?
I actually like checking in with both past self and future self on a daily basis. And it doesn't need to take long. I like mornings for future self and I like evenings for past self, although you can really do it however you want. But in the mornings, I think and everyone's different, but I think mornings are a really creative, pretty amazing time for the brain. If you can get into the habit of that. And I think that the mornings are a good time to visualize your future self, think about what your future self would do that day, kind of like the difference between being a human doing and a human being. If you're just going in routine mode, habits, how I look at it is habits are your current self, whereas being is your future self. Like being means you're being present. It means you're not on autopilot. It means you're actually thinking, what is the best possible potential for me right now, based on where I want to go. And then you can start getting new ideas. And so for me, I really like journaling in the morning. I have 5 prompts that I have in the front of all my journals. And I just ask myself these 5 prompts in the front of every journal. Question 1 is just, where am I right now? And I just have a list of bullets that's just describing my current life. In the case when I was writing this, which was 2 days ago, I said, I'm in Chicago in a church building. I said, I'm getting prepared to leave for a 6-week Europe trip, just bought a new house, pruning my life like crazy, connecting more with my wife. So I was just kind of giving a little bit of a context to my current self. But then the other questions I ask are, what are some of the wins I had from the last 90 days? And I just write down some of the adjustments, the changes, the tweaks, the achievements, the peak experiences. And then I say, what are the wins for the next 90? Just write down what I want to do in the next 90 days in terms of growth or progress. And then where do I want to be by the end of 12 months? Who's my future self 12 months from now? And then who's my future self 3 years from now? The only reason I share that is because when I open my journal, it's nice to have a trigger. And so I look at what I wrote and I just reflect on it. And then I kind of use that as the primer, kind of using Robert Cialdini's words, persuasion. Like you kind of, you set the context for your thinking. And I want my journaling to be from the context of my future self. And so, I think in the mornings it's fun. And back to your idea of play, I think playfulness and fun, there's a really great book recently called The Power of Fun, but, playfulness, fun, no distractions. Because if ever you have like a ping or a ding, that pulls you from flow. And flow is a core aspect of fun and play. True play, true fun is in a flow state. And so if you're trying to multitask, you won't be in flow. Therefore, you're not having true fun, or you're not having true play. And so give yourself space and find a fun little place. For me, it's honestly just in my car outside the gym. And it's become such a ritual that I love waking up, driving to the gym. And before I go in, and sometimes I have such a great journaling session that I never even go into the gym. I'm just like, I don't need that anymore. You know what I mean? Like, but I just think you can really prime yourself to have fun. And I always look at all of these things like a rough draft. Like, it really doesn't matter what I wrote today, because tomorrow I can maybe have a cleaner draft, and maybe I learned something in the next 24 hours that makes all of this irrelevant. And so I just look at it as constantly drafting, writing about my goals, writing about what I want, thinking about what my future self would do today. At the end of the day, and I think that this is just as important, but you could really do it at any time, but I just usually do it at the end of the day. It's just writing about, how am I different from who I was when I woke up? You know, like, what did I learn today that now makes everything slightly different? Or what were some experiences that I had? And so by referencing my past self, I'm always seeing that I'm changing. And then by referencing my future self, it just keeps me clear and intentional.
It sounds in part like what the Stoics do, the ancient Stoics, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and keeping kind of a journal, but they were keeping tabs on their growth. They didn't really talk about future self, which is what I think they were missing at the time, but they certainly were empowered victims. And that was one of the things they used, was journaling to review the day and what they did right, what they did wrong, how they could improve, stuff like that. But it leads to an interesting question, because you've been influenced by some of the metaphysical writers. And I know that Abraham, which is of Jerry and Esther Hicks, just Esther these days, talked about scripting. And scripting, the way they described it, is where you write out the future as if it's happening right now or did happen. So in other words, you're not writing down, here's what I want to have happen in the next 5 years. You're writing down, it's 5 years from now, and all of this took place today. So you're scripting your future. You are writing a description of something that in real time has not happened, but you write it as if it did happen, present time, 5 years out. What is your take on that?
I love that. I mean, that actually just fits with the idea of, rather than writing a letter to your future self, you write a letter from your future self.
Yeah.
And I think that is actually much more powerful. And interestingly, the research in psychology actually shows that that's actually the easier way to get to your future. It's easier to bring your future self to you rather than you going there.
I got chills when you said that. It's easier to bring your future self to you.
Yeah. Because if you're trying to go to your future self, that can be kind of hard for the same reasons we've been discussing, which is, your current imagination is so limited. They've actually attached this to odd theories. And I'm probably going to botch this now because I haven't thought about it for a while, but now you're sparking some thoughts. But when you drive somewhere, like, let's just say you're on a road trip and you're driving to a restaurant, and let's just say the restaurant's on the other side of town. Does it feel longer to get to the restaurant or to come home?
It feels longer to get there.
Why do you think that is? Just as a guess.
I've thought about it many times, because there have been many places where I've gone and it's like, it takes forever. When it was all over and I went home, it's like, what happened? Time was gone. I don't know. I was longing for the experience, probably more aware of the impatience of the desire to be there. I don't know that I ever articulated it, but it's something like that.
Yeah, you hit it on the head. So they call this the going home effect, that it's so much easier, even on a trip. Let's just say you're flying across the country and you're going to Disneyland or whatnot. Like, it may feel forever, like the whole thing, but when you're coming home, it feels so fast, because home is a lot broader of a concept than just where I live. Home could even be the United States if I'm out of the country. And when I'm back in the United States, I might even start to feel like I'm home. Now I'm in Florida, right? Now I'm back in the car. So coming home always feels faster. And so they use that and a lot of similar theories to talk about how it's so much faster and easier to bring your future self home, which is right here. And so I actually love the Abraham Hicks concept. And I actually find that that's a really powerful approach, which is just put yourself in the future, proclaim the future you want, describe the future. And then if you want to, you can start to actually even say, and again, back to the idea of play, say how you did it. Actually just literally practice with that and put yourself in the state, say, this is all the things that happened and here's how I did it. And be okay if that answer changes, but the future self can start to tell you how to do it. Or at least where to start go looking.
This is exciting. We're going to be running out of time, which really upsets me. But so I want to.
We can always do round 2 whenever you want.
we will do that. So I have a couple questions, and again, I'm just flying by the seat of my pants. And for the people watching, Dr. Ben and I did not get together beforehand. We did not share questions. He has no idea that I'm asking any of these things. And I didn't know that I would ask what I'm asking or say what I'm saying. This is live. This is spontaneous. This is raw. This is inspired. We're in our own flow. And out of my flow, I've got a question. Is the future self real? Meaning in some sort of sci-fi, quantum physics, I don't know how to explain it kind of universe, is that future self, Dr. Ben, out there talking to Dr. Joe? Do they exist? Is it real? Are they real?
I mean, there's probably a lot of theories and perspectives that would say that they are. I myself, I really don't know. I think that I do think that imagination is real, and I think that there's an infinite potential of futures that I have. In psychology, they call that prospection, which makes humans really amazing. That we can imagine infinite different futures, and then we can orient ourselves towards those futures. That's basically what it means to be intelligent. I don't know if there's infinite actual realities out there, and then I'm just tapping into one of them. But what I do know is that I've used my future self over and over again, and people might not use that terminology. I just think it's an easier way to get connected into the identity of the person you want to be, and then to start being that person now. But I've used my future self over and over to change old habits, or to become more aware, or to write a book. I mean, there was no way that I could have written a book without having the goal to do it. Even the research in psychology shows that deliberate practice, which is basically just learning, is impossible without having a future self that has already learned it. This house could have never been built without the imagination of the person to build it. We could have never done a rocket to the moon without having the goal to do it. And so you really do need, how I look at it as anything that's man-made. And also, I think anything that's God-made was first an idea, right? It was an idea that then took on physical form. Mental creation preceded physical creation. So the shirt I'm wearing is intelligent design. This book, Zoom, even me and you, we had the vision of having this conversation. We didn't really know fully what it would be, but it was an idea before it became a thing.
This is amazing. Let me ask you a quick question. It may end up being my final one because we're running out of time here. You have 6 kids, the last I checked. Have you been teaching them the future self science?
Yeah, definitely.
And how are they taking to it?
Well, so we have 3 kids that we adopted from the foster system, which are just epic. I mean, they're our kids. We in our mind, when we were, and this was back when I was at Clemson doing my PhD, we kind of came to the conclusion, if we could only have these kids and not our own biological ones, would we take it? And we're like, absolutely. So like, we see those kids as our own, but those kids are now 14, 12, and 10. And then we have 2 3-year-old twin girls, and then we have a 1-year-old boy, and we're definitely done, unless some crazy intervention occurs, but we're done. But as far as the older 3 who are now 14, 12, and 10, the 14-year-old is in a place where it's a lot easier for him to conceptualize his future self. So he's very into tennis right now. And I actually write about him in the future self book. I remember
that's in the book. Yes.
Yeah. And so we what's interesting about him is that he was someone who, for a long time, would bounce from thing to thing to thing to thing. Like he'd play baseball for a season, then jump to some other sport. And he never actually, like, whenever something got difficult, he would change the thing. But he's now getting to a place, and especially with tennis, where like he wants to go and play college tennis. And so he's visualizing his future self doing that. And so now, like, we've gotten him into some amazing tennis academies, and he's really talking to his coaches and finding pathways through these mentors. When the student is ready, the teacher kind of appears. Now that he's really starting to think, I would like to play college tennis, now we're starting to orient him towards potential pathways of getting there. and he's getting really committed. But one of the things we're really trying to do with him is to keep it fun. Like I like the idea of committing to the end result, but being non-committed in all the results along the way. So like we have him go to play tennis tournaments and stuff. And it's like, dude, it does not matter if you win or lose, just have fun and just learn as much as you can from it. The result right here doesn't matter. If you just keep practicing, playing and having fun, and also like actually listening and learning, you'll get to where you want to go, as long as you keep that end in mind. And so he's like one of the things that I share in the book, which I like, is the thing that Jim Collins said, which is if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. And so for me, I've conceptualized my future self in 3 ways. Obviously, I'm more multidimensional than just 3 ways, but as far as hyper focus, hyper deliberate practice, I'm really only focused on 3 priorities. And I kind of just teach him that. I'm like, what are the 3 most important areas to your future self when you're 18 years old and 4 or 5 years from now? And one, he's really clear. He wants to play college tennis, and so we're like, well, what are the other 2 most important areas of your life? And what's your future self in those areas? And so he's at a place mentally, emotionally, where we can start working with him on that. And he's starting to see beautiful progress. The other 2, who are 12 and 10, we can mess with it a little bit, but we can't really go as deep.
That's great. Thank you. Is there a question you wish I had asked? Is there a question you were hoping before we got on the call? Boy, I hope Joe asked this question. I hope somebody asked me this question. I really want to talk about this. Somebody asked me. Was there a question?
I don't think there was a question I was hoping you would ask me, but I will just say that for me, one of the big ahas in writing this book, and it's kind of a layer of connections that for me is a big aha / epiphany, is just that, and like the psychological definition of identity is whatever it is you're most committed to. And as people, we're all committed to a future. Back to the beginning of the conversation, that future may be a default future that you didn't even know you were driving towards, but we're all committed to a future, and you can know what you're committed to by just observing your behavior. Like I obviously was committed to having this conversation because here I am, and so obviously it was within my identity to come and have this conversation. Anyone who's listening to this conversation committed to listening to this conversation, and there's evidence because you're doing it. And so you can know what you're committed to by the results you're producing and by the behaviors you're engaging in. And if you're engaging in a behavior, it's because it's within your identity. And so your identity really is what you're most committed to. And your identity is the thing driving your behavior. And and pulling it all together, your identity is basically the future you're committed to. And for a lot of people, that future is just urgent battles, or it's short-term dopamine hits. And for all of us, it's a mix. I mean, I certainly am a person who have my own addictions and habits. And sometimes I just want to just jump on a dopamine hit, or sometimes I do get caught up in urgent battles and I'm not zoning back and thinking about a much bigger future self. I mean, we can all go through zones, but once you start wanting to create the future that you want, and you want to start scaling that and making kind of bigger quantum leaps, the beautiful epiphany is that we're all being driven by the future, not the past. It's whatever future we're most committed to. And if you just want to be aware of the future you're most committed to, just observe your own behavior, because that's the future you're most committed to. That's the goals that are driving your behavior. We're all driven by goals. But if you want to start being driven by different and better goals, you can, getting new inputs and, actually starting to have imagination, using different language, being around different people. Once you start getting committed to a new future, your identity is immediately connected to that new future, and your behavior will follow. So I just think it's, future, identity, and behavior are all combined.
This is amazing. You are doing phenomenal work. I can't thank you enough for making the time. I'm honored. I am grateful. I do want to have a round 2 with you at some point, maybe when I actually have your book in my hands.
We'll get it to you. We'll make sure.
Right. I've been talking to Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He's the author of Be Your Future Self Now, which you can go to Amazon and get. He's got a website, futureself.com, where you can pre-order the book or order it if it's out by now, or download a sample chapter, futureself.com. Futureself.com. I'm a fan of everything he's written, including Personality Isn't Permanent, all the other books, but the new one is Be Your Future Self Now. I'm Dr. Joe Vitale. This is Zero Limits Living. Every week I bring you inspiration and information to help transform your life. I want to thank Lux Media, Candace Barr, Chris, who's in the studio today. You can watch the show on Lux TV app. Just download the Lux TV app. It's also on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire. It's all over the place. And I put a website up, ZeroLimitsLivingTV.com, ZeroLimitsLivingTV.com. I love you all. Thanks for being here. And remember, expect miracles.
Glutathione is a big word. It's the body's own master antioxidant. It's a scavenger for free radical, bacteria, and viruses. There are no products in the market with the ingredient NASET. NASET increases the production of glutathione that's in our body already to strengthen and enhance our immune system, elevate sense of well-being, support muscle strength and endurance, cognitive function, and liver support. It helps with increased energy and blood sugar regulation. Get your bottle of GSH Plus from www.salvationnutra.com.